Hello everyone, welcome back to Dan's Astrology. Today is the 7th of October 2025. The topic for today, Mercury in Scorpio in a square to Pluto in Aquarius. Now, a lot of astrologers recommend that when talking about aspects to Pluto, you use a tight orb, and this is basically because if you look at the size of Pluto compared to the other planets, Pluto is incredibly small. And there's also, Pluto is commonly known for being the planet which people question whether it's really a planet, whether it should be included with the planets. One of the reasons for this is due to the difference in size. The other reason is due to the fact that most of the planets hang out on the ecliptic, which means that they kind of sit at a straight line. They kind of vary a little bit with us, but Pluto varies a lot more. And actually, Pluto apparently is out of bounds, meaning that Pluto's drifted quite a bit from the ecliptic. I have to admit that when it comes to the technical details of astronomy, I don't claim to be as technically proficient as all the other astrologers, but I do think one thing that's interesting is that this is a scan from an old book from the 80s that I just found somewhere, and one of the things that I find interesting about this book is that if you look at Pluto here, the diameter, we can compare the actual numbers for the size of the planets. Recently, I made a video about Venus in the South Node in which I suggested that the signification for Venus could come from the fact that Earth and Venus are very close to being the same size, and Venus is also the closest planet to Earth. So there's this idea of the combination of closeness, proximity, and also familiarity, at least in the same, being near the same size, right? And so Mercury, on the other hand, is much smaller, and Mars is about half the size of Earth. And if you compare this with Pluto, it's interesting that Pluto is like half the size of Mercury, and Pluto is even smaller than the Moon. But then if we compare the other information, like, for example, the mass, Pluto's mass, it's very dense, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So there's something about what Pluto, the signification for Pluto, which comes to stand for, is something that is like the Princess and the Pea, something which is very minute. It's like having the grit, it's like it takes grit to get into the clamshell, to irritate, to create the pearl, right? Or there's some kind of like the yeast, right? You could take a very small amount of yeast to agitate a fermentation process or something. Pluto is like this small irritant, but due to its very small size, it's suggested that what astrologers, when you're measuring the aspects to Pluto, that you use a very tight orb. So that's what I'm doing today. And I have a more complicated philosophical diatribe to go on about Pluto. But before I do that, I'm going to just show you that today is the 7th of October, 2025, and that if you wind it back one day, yesterday, Mercury was on the 29th degree of Libra, and so we just had Mercury ingress, making the square to Pluto. And you will notice that Mars in Scorpio is also sharing the sign with Mercury, and that Mercury is in direct motion, of course, making the direct ingress into Scorpio, and Mercury is doing about 1 or 2 degrees a day right now. So Mercury is actually moving fairly fast. So we're in the fast phase of the Mercury synodic cycle, and Mercury is going to be conjoining with Mars here at the 18th degree of Scorpio on the 19th of October. And you will also notice all these triangles going on here, indicating the trine between Jupiter in Cancer and Saturn in Pisces. We are headed straight for grand water trine season with the water. If you have placements in the third decan of any water sign, this one is going to be a little bit of a bumpy ride, based with all the water third decans are going to be fully loaded with this one. And what is to add to make matters worse with this is that I'm going to go a little bit further, because we are talking about Mercury here, the planet, perhaps the most popular planet in astrology, due to the ever popular Mercury retrograde trope, right? That all sorts of people who don't know anything about astrology know about Mercury retrograde. So with that in mind, it's important to consider that if we keep going further here, once we're in Scorpio season, Mercury will ingress into Sagittarius and make it to, let's see here, Mars shortly behind. Here we go. The 6th degree of Sagittarius, Mercury will station retrograde and then make a retrograde conjunction with Mars right after, basically right as it stations. And then we're getting a double Mercury-Mars conjunction with this Mercury retrograde. And then Mercury retrograde will conjunct Venus in Scorpio. And then we'll station direct. And so then leading us into December, where we will have both Venus and Mars and the Sun all together in Sagittarius, leading into the new moon in the full moon in Gemini. But we just had a full moon in Aries, so I'm 2 full moons ahead of myself here. So we're kind of going a little bit. We're kind of getting a little bit into the future. But what's fun about doing astrology is, instead of just talking about Mercury and Scorpio, I'm considering the whole dance that's going to play out between Mercury and Mars, and in Scorpio, and then in Sagittarius, and then a Mercury retrograde that's going to go back into Scorpio and hang out with Venus in Scorpio. So this is going to be some pretty hectic time for anybody who has water placements, or anybody who has Sagittarius mutable placements, which, to be fair, my own chart is getting fairly rocked by this one. Now, the thing also to consider, though, is that another topic for another video is that in the meantime, we will eventually have Venus in Libra, where Venus is in pretty good dignity throughout all this. I'm going to leave that for another time, okay? So for now, we're going to talk about Mercury. This is basically the problem with Mercury. Okay, first of all, there's certain things going on when you have Mercury and this Mars thing going on, and also the fact that we have the square root of Pluto. I'm going to focus right now on the square root of Pluto, because that's the most topical thing for today. There's a certain Pluto sometimes stands for hidden power dynamics, conspiracies, shadowy underworld stuff, because it's, Hades, Pluto, Lord of the Underworld. I was also, it's kind of just an anecdotal coincidence, perhaps, that today I've been walking. I get up fairly early, and I have this one dog that I walk. I used to have 2 dogs. We had to put one of the dogs down this year because she was getting too old and her diabetes health problems were getting worse. But I have one dog that I walk in the morning, and I for a second thought I saw a UFO, but then I thought, you know what? I've heard about this Elon Musk SpaceX Starlink satellite array. Maybe that's what I'm seeing. And then I looked it up when I got back, and what do you know? I saw the SpaceX Starlink array. And you know, even if this wasn't a legitimate, I mean, it wasn't a UFO sighting because the orbital object was easily identified as this, but it looks kind of odd. It looks like a string of Christmas lights just traveling through the sky. Um, and I guess it's just an array of satellites all lined up together. But I saw it this morning. Take it what you will. There's also the Atlas asteroid, or whatever it is. This object Atlas has entered our solar system near Mars. And so this is, quite frankly, the pictures from the Mars rover are kind of grainy and blurry and disappointing. And I'm not going to put too much on that one right now, but it's also worth mentioning in terms of strange outer space objects which may or may not be legitimate. There's something about with Pluto. There could be like, I'm thinking about the tiny little smallness of Pluto compared to the other planets, and I personally, from an astrologer point of view, if you're using the outer planets, you're going to include Pluto. It's not really but there's kind of funny how Pluto is this thing which could be either included or omitted, and it reminds me about like that, the question of whether you want to include Pluto or not is almost similar to like censorship or cancel culture. The thing is, there are a lot of other there's also a lot of solar system objects that, like Chiron, for example, which I'm not going to get into this. It's a touchy issue. You don't want to start some sort of astrology beef with people who choose to include planets. I've got Chiron up here. There's certain planets which I'm not including all the time, such as like Ceres and Juno and Vesta, which I'm just not as familiar with, and I don't claim expertise. So I'm just focusing more on the planets, and with Rick Tarnas style archetypal astrology, there's good. I don't know. There's a good and well fleshed out archetypal language for these outer planets: Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus. If you consider what I was saying earlier about censorship and stuff, you can obviously see what just played out recently with Jimmy Kimmel getting hired and fired and all this kind of stuff, as being there's a certain touchiness right now in the aftermath of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, where it seemed to be like the hammer came down on Jimmy Kimmel really hard, and now people are unsure about the risk of censorship, or the fact that it looks like a kind of a political powder keg, basically, in America. And with basically, this is what I'm thinking of. There is the Pluto as these kind of like, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. This sort of kind of forced control of politeness or omission or censorship or trying to clean things up, and the versus the like there could be arguments, some sort of heated words, debates, I mean, there's basically this thing playing out right now with the politics in the United States, in that when it comes, there's also, with Pluto, of course, there's the fact that Pluto historically was discovered around the same time that fascism became a historical force. And there's a problem basically going on with the politics of America and the topic of political extremism, basically, whether that's fascism or whatever you want to call it, in that, or basically what showed up with Charlie Kirk was political violence. And the whether or not using language like fascism to describe somebody is itself to be considered a call for violence on that person, because, or that there's this basic problem with the category of fascism in itself, which would be kind of similar perhaps to like you could also say that if you're just going to call yourself a revolutionary, it's sort of like if you were to choose to describe yourself as a revolutionary, you would be openly declaring yourself in confrontation with the established government with whom you set to have a revolution against, right? So whether or not the label itself is accurate, the act of openly labeling and declaring yourself with that label in self declares a certain kind of intent, whereas if you were the person who stood to be dethroned by the revolutionary, then you have just, it's up to you to defend against that threat, basically, right? So the whole problem about people who identify with various extremist positions, whether that's to be a revolutionist or a revolutionary or a fascist extremist or you name it, there could be all sorts of different flavors, is that there could be certain people who just by category of identity are hostile. There's inherent hostility, basically, right? And so with Pluto, with this Mercury square Mars thing, it could be that it's wise not to just trigger off pointless hostility for no reason. But then there's also kind of this funny thing about this too, which there's a sort of thing that feels very gaslighty about it, in the fact that there's like, if there's going to be some kind of underlying hostility that's just going to be like the elephant in the room that nobody talks about, and everybody tries to be more polite than necessary, and then you'd like trigger the libs, and then you blame the person for reacting, you just don't have like the discipline over your emotions because you're reacting to this sort of hostile. But then we're gonna like do these things which are like subtly hostile, right? But it's like, are we really hostile or are we not, right? And then if you're reacting, you're just making a mountain out of a molehill. But there's something about the archetype of Pluto, that Pluto, the way it's so small, it's kind of like these Pluto transits kind of seem like there's a sort of the threat may be a small, tiny micrograin of an issue compared to the weightiness of something like Saturn and Jupiter, for example, right? The traditional big boy outer planets. Pluto, in comparison, could be something like the slight, like people who have like nut allergies or something like that, right? If you're allergic to peanuts, it doesn't take very much of a peanut to fuck with your whole system. But but it's whether it could be your own, your immune system freaks out because it recognizes the peanut allergy and kind of overreacts to it or something like that. And so there's this kind of thing about like the legitimacy of a threat making a mountain out of a molehill versus also a legitimate threat that you're gaslighting about, or it's just, maybe it's just psychosomatic. Or there's this kind of thing. I have to admit, I was going through some of my parents' old books that they were thinking about. Where we have quite a stash of books, and I found a Deepak Chopra book, and Deepak Chopra has something in there about being offended, and like it's kind of funny because it's like in this day and age, in this context, there's this issue about whether you're like personally offended by something or whether you're like offended on behalf of something, right? Like if I'm like, there's this kind of issue about being like a white liberal, or there's a certain the liberal Canadian progressive nationalism, which is kind of an odd combo, but because it's like oftentimes nationalism is associated with the far right, but being a Canadian, in contrast, where if you have a nationalistic pride, in contrast to America being all like, well, at least we're progressive where I live, and at least we have certain ideals of liberalism and social democracy and a progressive society here, and that we're doing a good job of this compared to some other places. That could be like a progressive liberal nationalism where you have a certain kind of like, I don't know how to help America, but I can at least be relieved that we have our own sovereignty and that we aren't America, right? And that, hold on, I'm kind of getting, where am I going with this? There's a certain liberal, you need to speak with tact, politeness. Sometimes this could create the sense of a veneer of inauthenticity, or that you're overly sanitized language, or being kind of like, there is this thing I've noticed that, like, oh man, we live in a culture these days where it's really common to get really like jacked at the gym, so that if there's any sort of threat or of confrontation, you are a tough-looking guy that people aren't going to mess with, I guess. I don't know if that's the appeal. Like, you feel confident because you have big muscles and you're really tough and something like that. But there's something what I have found in that oftentimes, it's like you could think about the ability to, if you were playing like an RPG or something like that, and like instead of challenging somebody to combat, to be able to use your wits and your charisma, or to basically talk your way out of a confrontation. Like, there's something with Mercury and Mars and Pluto here that feels kind of like at least if you're going to play out do you see the pros and cons of this one? There could be in this dynamic there could be potential confrontations which are diffused if you know how to work the social leverage, right? If you know how to, the people who are potentially, this is what is also funny about this, is that like where I live in Canada, well, I have to admit that, some of the criticisms Donald Trump may have of the Canadians of crime and drug use and poverty and all this kind of stuff, we do have some fairly slummy neighborhoods that, some people, there's something weird about the media, right? That I find that it creates, there's a certain, what I'm trying to say about Pluto is that there's a certain grain of truth to it, but this grain of truth may be over exaggerated, like making a mountain out of a molehill. And so like, there's something kind of thing where it's like in Vancouver, it is true that when the downtown east side is particularly a rough area, and that foreigners or people that are not local to the area are often taken completely off guard by how rough it is. And that, there's stories about like famous rappers in Vancouver who are like straight up feeling intimidated, like the place is too tough, or people are basically, there's certain venue. I find it sad. I don't go to shows as much since the pandemic, but prior to the pandemic, there was this venue called the Imperial, which I have to say, there's so many bad venue problems that if you like rock and roll music, you will be forever plagued by shitty rock venues where the sound is terrible, you can't hear anything, and like or else you can't see anything. Like, it's just not laid out very well for rock. Like, there's all sorts of design issues for a rock and roll venue that makes it a poor choice or whatever. But there's this venue called the Imperial where they seem to just have solved every problem. And I saw Thurston Moore play after the breakup of Sonic Youth there, where he had the bassist from My Bloody Valentine. I also saw this band Tortoise there, kind of alt rock, jazz, progressive, experimental kind of instrumental band, and it was just a great music venue. And what's odd is that they shut down because they're just a couple blocks away from Main and Hastings, and apparently it's like all the hip hoppers were too scared to play next. This is kind of thing. It's like there's a certain thing where it's like people, and then people create this image of like, damn, like it's like I could go to so many. I used to go to so many like great music events in close proximity to really rough neighborhoods. And if you're like a local and you're like a rocker, nobody gives you trouble. But if you're if you're going to be like these really tough, it's sort of like if you're approaching the same situation from this different subjectivity, then you will treat the whole area as this like, it's like total hostile danger. It could be that everything got worse after COVID. I don't go down there as much. I mean, maybe it is just legitimately worse, but I saw so many good shows down there. I never had a problem. But this is the kind of thing where it's like, it starts to feel like you're in this sort of like doppelganger parallel reality where there is sort of a grain of truth to certain things. Like, for example, as a Canadian, in that neighborhood, there is a strong problem with drugs and crime and homelessness and all that kind of stuff. But the thing is, when like that, the issues that we have as a society with those things, then are used against us by the Trump government because we are blamed for fentanyl making its way across the border into the United States, even though this is basically ridiculous if you think about it, because you could just there's more of that stuff going the other way than there is going, and there's just, I don't know, it's just kind of silly. Of course we have I think with this whole dynamic with also keep in mind that Neptune is here, and there's certain kind of like Neptune is sextile to Pluto. There's a certain thing about it makes me think about escapism or intoxication or like anesthetic or something, or numbing yourself out or something. But then there's a sense that like being in a kind of the politics start to take on this quality of like the fever dream of almost a hallucination or a delusion, or just like kind of baseless accusations that aren't actually really grounded in reality, but of course may have a grain of truth. But there's some kind of difference between like, admitting that there is a problem to the neighborhood, but then that, I don't know, it's just, this is just where I'm going with it. There's also with this in mind, this is kind of an issue about talking what you're allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say, or of choosing your battles in terms of arguments to certain topics of conversation, topics of discussion. For example, in the same way that I'm choosing not to talk about the finer points of, there's all these other planets, such as was it Eris? There's some of these trans-Neptunian, some of these, what are they called? The Kuiper belt, these far out objects. That there's other objects the same size as Pluto, but Pluto. We're going to include Pluto because it's just sort of like conveniently within what the commonly accepted system of modern astrology. But there's some issue here around basically the topic of fascism, the timing of Pluto. And this goes to our idea of like totalitarian control, the fascist society, whether or not we can even talk about fascism. And I have to admit that since COVID happened, I figured, since I had so much time where I wasn't going out and partying like I used to, I might as well try to exercise my little brain muscles and read some edgy French hard-hitting philosophy from Deleuze and Guattari, right? And I read the Capitalism and Schizophrenia books since the COVID happened. I finished them, and now I'm just reading more Deleuze. And there's something, the whole thing is introduced as a guide against fascism, basically. So it's just it's a topic that I'm interested in, to be against fascism. And one of the things that interests me about it is that I do also like doing astrology, and there is perhaps this is one thing I have to tread lightly here, because this could be an area where there's something I have to admit, especially Hellenistic astrology, the way that it's all about, like, who were charts done for back in the day? They were done for the emperors, the great leaders. They're basically done for these, like, patriarchal warrior kings of these violent imperialistic societies, and they were really even done for women, let alone for common people, right? And so if you keep this in mind, there's a sort of kind of double thing going on with astrology, in that in the modern era, astrology has become popular. There's a certain stereotype of the demographic of the astrology audience as being usually more women oriented. And this basically a lot of this has to do with the fact that in the modern era, the average person now had access to do astrology, to cast their own chart, and then with computers, this was made increasingly more democratized, so that anyone could cast their own chart. And there's this idea that the technology has some way of disrupting. This is kind of Uranus, but the technology disrupts the old hierarchy and gives the things like tools like astrology to the common people. But they were, traditionally part of the hierarchical power structure of empire, right? And the thing about this is that, and also this whole idea that there's something. Where does fascism come into this? The interesting thing about fascism is that there are certain things that are precursors to fascism that are not. It's hard. One of the problems about this, I find, is how do we define what fascism is? And prior to fascism, there were things like imperialism, as well as the blurred. What happens with the Catholic Church and the Inquisition, things which technically don't have anything to do with fascism. But if you've got a system of authority which takes itself to have some sort of totalitarian control over the truth and get to be the arbiters of the official dogma of what is true or false, what is right or wrong, what is the gospel, and then they go around persecuting anybody who doesn't agree with them or who doesn't say the right thing. These are sort of precursors. Like, you can see that whatever the Gestapo or the secret police were doing, they didn't just come out of nowhere. These were all sort of patterns that were already existing, that just sort of were activated in a certain historical moment, in around the 1930s and the 1940s, right? So there's something about how there's all these other sort of dynamics, which I wouldn't describe as being fascist, but they kind of pre-exist this. But there's something that. So I watched a video. Some guy came up with this definition of fascism that I have to admit I didn't really like very much. But he was defining fascism as, to reduce it to its simplest point, something that divides humanity into subhumans and superhumans, right? But one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that, regardless of this funny thing about dividing into subhumans and superhumans, is that if you look historically at the hierarchies of society, that even if we just talk about astrology and who would be the candidate for getting a chart done, you would have to be part of, like, the royal class. You'd have to have the royal astrologer of the king who has specialized knowledge to do. It wouldn't just be the average person doing this kind of stuff. And so that you would have this class position that even if you were the kind of person who was important enough to deem that you would get this attention from the official astrologer of the king or whatever. You'd have to be existing in a certain higher stratum of social class and privilege or whatever. And so it's only the part of the issue with the modern era is that there's some kind of there's this kind of liberal principle of liberal democracy, which takes these old things which were previously concentrated in the higher power structures and democratizes them by making them more available and making them more accessible to the average Joe, the average person, right? Now, there's certain risks in this, which I think also relate to the archetype of Pluto, which could be that the average Joe, the average person, may experience certain resentment if they are trying to read their chart as if they are a prince or a princess or the queen of some dynasty, when you're just some Joe schmuck like everybody else, and you have to live your ordinary life that maybe you're not, so like the whole thing is, it's like there's a kind of grandiose dream of like what these archetypes, the potential they could hold, but oftentimes we just have, but the whole point of this is that to be thankful for what we have in life, and that we don't need to be everything to be super intense and dramatic all the time, right? But this is the whole thing, is that the movement is it's funny because the movement of popular astrology is, on one hand, a kind of this liberal democratizing of what used to be very exclusive, but it's not really like. What's funny about when you start to bring in the problem about transhumanism or this idea of the superhuman is that, and then we get into the Pluto and Aquarius stuff, right? Which is Aquarius, very cyberpunk, technological kind of signification going on with Pluto and Aquarius. There's this thing that I'm a huge fan of Marshall McLuhan, and Marshall McLuhan spoke about technology as being the extension of the human, right? And the idea is that prior to the advent of computers and all this kind of stuff, you could still consider astrology or divination as a kind of a technology, right? And think about tarot cards. Tarot cards could even be perhaps considered a very simplistic kind of divination tool, because a person would not have to be trained in doing all the complex mathematical equations of studying charts and ephemeris and all this kind of stuff. You could know absolutely nothing about any of these complicated stuff. You could just have a pack of tarot cards, pull a few tarot cards at random, and then read symbolistically what cards come up, right? You don't have, whereas there's a certain technique of astrology of casting a chart back in the olden days, which now this has become democratized. And it's like, basically, I have to admit, one of my weak points is I'm not really good with math and the sciences, but I am fairly good with computers. But the whole thing about computers is always a certain kind of like outsourcing jobs to the calculation is done by something else. So it's like extends your ability, right? In the same way that I wouldn't be able to run like the same speed as riding a bike or riding a motorcycle or driving a car, the computer extends my abilities, right? And so there's a kind of funny thing about what confuses me about the topic of transhumanism is that I have to admit that topically, with Elon Musk, I just saw the crazy Starlink satellite in the sky. The same guy who put that thing up in the air has also talked about making, direct computer brain implants, and that's kind of disturbing, right? The whole point is that even if you are kind of, and there's also the whole like funny Peter Thiel transhumanism, even if you say no to that kind of stuff, is that the topic of transhumanism still applies to just using a computer or any kind of technology which gives us an enhanced range of ability that we wouldn't have if we didn't use that technology. Still technically transhumanism, still technically an evolution or a progression over what we were not able to do before. And the thing is interesting about this is that if you go with this whole idea of the monarchy and the king, as the whole theocracy stuff about the Pope and the Church and the king being the king is God's chosen representative on earth, following that old way of thinking, if you follow me, and that, of course, astrology is kind of controversial. There were Christian astrologers and people who reconciled that. But if you were also to be the kind of a king who employed court astrologers or court magicians or something like that, or whatever you say, however you would describe it, that because you're doing this all analog, you would be doing it analog style without the aid of these computers that extend our abilities. You would still have the technique, but not the technology. You would be able, this basically would create a stratum of a certain class of people who had the privileged access to this stuff, but they were separated from the common people, the peasant folk, and basically, it's basically the whole issue about fascism, how to define fascism. I would define fascism specifically in this dynamic where astrology is a great example of this, because you have what was previously the privileged access of the elites becoming democratized to the public, and then in response to this, fascism is a kind of reaction to this democratic process, which seeks to, rather than to embrace the democratizing force of what's going on, to instead conserve some kind of aristocratic power structure in which certain classes of people are inherently, well, that's what they're kind of going for, right? Inherently better than others. No, this is not a good definition of fascism. The thing about fascism is that I think there is some kind of default. If you pay attention to the way it works, is that how did monarchy work? Monarchy worked by bloodline and inheritance, not by democracy, right? So the idea is that the old power structure after the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, where monarchies were getting disrupted, is that there's some kind of need to protect the old power structure in the face of the progress of history, basically, right? Now, the problem is there's also kind of interesting is that there are even people who do not identify as fascists or even conservatives will look back historically at these revolutions as being terribly bloody, violent things that even if they had perhaps some kind of goal of a more just and equal society, there's a tremendous amount of violence involved, right? And for this reason, it's there's also this kind of line that all revolutions are failed revolutions, right? There's this kind of thing about the progress to evolve away from this old power concentration versus the trying to find a way to retain those power structures. But to understand, first of all, that the old power structure was hereditary, ancestral, and that there's some basic sense that there's always some kind of power dynamic with the family. And I'm I could do a self-critique here and talk about, one of the things about this is that, in the same way that I don't think it's right for a family to put a lot of content about, if you're parents and you have a small child, you don't want to be like having that child's whole life growing up is going to be put on social media before they haven't grown into the point where they can comprehend whether or not they should even consent to this or have any ability to consent. Basically, they don't even have a child would not have the ability to consent to being recorded and documented and all this kind of stuff. And so, in the same sense that I don't want to get into all my family stuff and make it public because it's like it would be basically, But there's the family dynamic of living with your family. There's a certain, whether or not, like, there's this obvious thing that happens. I've been watching Succession, basically, which is all about corporate nepotism, right? Where it's like, you could be a very powerful person in society, but what you're doing basically is you're just inheriting a position without necessarily, it's not like a democratic process where everybody is fairly evenly competing. It's like you are unfairly inheriting the power structure, and that liberalism is supposedly a kind of emancipation, or to make this more egalitarian, right? But the underlying dynamic is that if you fall on hard, like, what if this basic idea that if you fall on hard times, do you have your family there to support you or not, right? And the fact that personal, without getting into my family's stuff, if I live with my family and that I have my family there to support me, and then there's a certain kind of, like, even if I don't inherit like a big like nepotism, this like lofty corporate position that has all this power, I'm still a fairly low member of society. But there's some basic default family power where if you fall on hard times, your family is there to support you, that kind of thing. This is something there that exists in a way that a totally liberal, democratic, egalitarian society would not have that, right? You would have, like, everybody. What if the world was everybody just treated each other like roommates, right? There wasn't you didn't get any special, like, your family's going to give you some sort of special treatment or give you some sort of special privilege that you don't, you have to be, there's one way to behave, and it's like, if you can't keep up a certain standard of behavior that would be expected of a roommate, then your family is not going to put up with that either, kind of thing. Like, it's kind of like there's a certain angle to this, but there's also kind of funny if you look at the way that the housing crisis is working right now. There's a tremendous concentration. Like, this is also the archetype of Pluto, what I was trying to get at, where if you look at how small Pluto is, it's interesting that its density is at 6, which is quite a lot more dense than a lot of these other planets. It's very dense planet. Its mass is more dense than whatever. It's this tiny but very dense thing, right? Maybe I'm going all over the place. I basically think there's something going on with Pluto, the way fascism has to do with racism or isolating certain groups of people as subhuman. Like, if you compare it to the old monarchy thing, if you were the royal family, then everybody beneath you would be considered to be subhuman relative to your advanced status as the privileged aristocrat, basically, right? But if you forget about if you take away this thing about, like, being superhuman or subhuman, and you just look at, if you fall on hard times, you have your family there to support you, or maybe you inherit a position from your family, or inherit some degree of wealth from your family, whatever, right? And this creates a sort of sense of inequality or different hierarchies or something like that. There's still this basic issue of, like, your family is going to give you some sort of treatment that the average Joe Schmo isn't going to give you. And so it gives, or then it creates this whole system where it's like your family as a team playing against other families as teams, which starts to sound familiar, as if it's like Game of Thrones, or basically you think about the whole thing about like the medieval coat of arms. Like, this is the coat of arms representing our family, and that you're trying to get you're competing for the throne. You're trying to play this aristocratic game to get your family in line for the to marry somebody or something, whatever you have to do to play the game so that you get the power. But it's not based on an egalitarian democratic process. It's all about some sort of hidden power structure, and playing the levers of power to but it's all, there's something about it, it's all baked in with this kind of family thing, and like, who's got your back? Can you trust you can trust your family more than you can trust some friend or something like that, right? And there's I'm rather than point my finger and accuse other people of being fascist, to the extent that I basically have, there's a weird structure of our society, the way that I'm just going to be upfront about it. There's this whole issue about the male loneliness epidemic that they talk about. And the thing about this is, I read a book where they're talking about Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson, the famous American poet, was often considered to be a very solitary figure. But the thing is that she lived with her family her whole life. And so that she was only considered to be a solitary figure in that she kind of was like a homebody. She didn't go out very much. She kind of lived in a house with her family out in the country, but she was not really there's this kind of idea where the loneliness thing of being alone is like to be like, oh well, if you consider somebody who lives with their family lonely or alone, the idea is that, it's not that they're not surrounded with people, that they're not like out partying or they're not doing all this stuff with their peers, is that it's a difference to be like, I'm a lonely person that lives with my family versus being somebody who is actually literally isolated. Like, you would not have any contact with any people. You would not speak to any people unless you had some sort of social interaction or something. You know what I'm saying? It's a completely different idea of what loneliness is, right? And there's this kind of underlying thing about fascism, is that if you notice, there's a certain trying to get the masses to mass together in this big angry mob, right? Or populism. There's this idea that, for one thing, there's a really big emphasis on familialism, but oftentimes this isn't the familial. It's like, you're lonely if you're an adult that lives with your family. You're like a failure in life, and you've had to fall back on the support of your family, and it's basically a source of shame and all this kind of stuff. But however, if you go and start a family and reproduce, then you're doing the right thing. And familialism is like trad wifery, and familialism is very emphasized. But there's this whole issue about basically intergenerational living, where it's like, if I'm basically, it's not just because like you save a lot of money living with your family, or that if your there's this basically idea as like there's a certain code of familial living, that your family is kind of, if you're not all turned against each other, then you exist as a kind of an economic block where you can sort of depend on your family to stick together, work as a team, get things done. And I'm basically, compared to that, to renting is always, I find, a lot more individualistic, right? And like, for example, like this whole thing, like my family is funny because compared to, apparently we're like a weird anomaly, because my family has always really been big into having proper family dinners, apparently like it's always, whenever I rent a place, it's always very strange to me because it's more of like this, like with a lot of people just eat takeout most of the time, because if you have to work the hours that it takes to pay rent or whatever, you probably are spending all your time and energy working, and so you're going to be too tired to cook and clean, so you just do takeout. And then if anybody has a social dinner, it's going to be like a special event. Like we're going to have a dinner party and we're going to like try to cook for our friends and put on like a special, but other than that, people are just eating takeout like all the time. Or that there's this idea that if you're cooking, you're going to make like a sandwich for yourself. You're going to be like, instead of like cooking for communally, it's highly individual. You can have a whole bunch of people, like 5 people sharing the same house, but then everybody has to cook their own meal or do their own meal planning this highly individualized way. And it comes to like, if you can swing this family thing where people are working more in a communal than individualized thing, it's actually, you've got an advantage, right? And so there's some kind of thing about like it, or like, and this kind of thing about like delegating tasks, like who's going to do the cooking, cleaning, who's going to do the yard work, who's going to do the grocery shopping. If you can kind of like, rather than trying to be like, the funny thing about, compared this to a highly individualized renting culture, that if you rent a place and it comes to things like mowing the lawn or raking leaves, if you're renting, you don't have to do that at all. It's entirely up to your landlord to do that, right? Or your landlord to hire people to do that for you. But then this creates this whole thing where when you're renting a place, you're not just paying for the place you're renting. You're now paying for the gardeners. You're paying for the people to do all the cleaning the gutters. You're paying for people to all the maintenance on the house, right? Like, and it's not like all of that is included. I don't know. Maybe but it creates this whole thing where, I don't know. It's like there's a sort of power dynamic that comes from familialism. And that rather than me pointing my finger at other people and accusing them of being fascists, I think something about fascism, the image of it is a group, a bundle of sticks that are these things that are weak on their own, but if you bundle them together and put like an axe blade in it, it's like a strong weapon that you use in a violent way to hit people, right? And the fact that if you get people to be this team spirit, that if we all work together, we'll be more strong or something like that. And that if you but there's the issue too about it turns into this thing where you scapegoating whoever is the weakest link, right? And this becomes the whole thing about RFK Jr. and eugenics and how they target people like the disabled people. Or there's this whole superiority dynamic, right? Where they don't want to just have a bundle of weak things bundling together. They want, but there's this irony here too, in that if you read Carl Jung's Undiscovered Self, he kind of does this thing where he takes aim at both fascists and communists, and he tries to criticize both of them, that they have not discussed. Like, this is kind of like Carl Jung style individualism, where it's like that the problem is not that we're too individualistic, is that we're not individualistic enough, because we have not been able to discover our ability to be individuals, that we're tempted to join these mass movements. This was Hannah Arendt's criticism that apparently fascism, in order to get people to be fascists, you have to make them feel lonely and isolated, so that the only way for them to feel like they belong or to be part of something is to join some sort of mass movement where there's and the thing about this is also, it's just like there's a sort of like underlying thing where if you want immediate belonging, then you just sort of group up with people who have the same ethnic background or religion or whatever it is, the same ancestral thing going on, and then it's just, because the whole thing about it is like, if I was down and out and I needed, if I needed somebody to bail me out, you could count on your family to bail you out, but you couldn't count on the random, person of a different ethnicity to bail you out. They don't have any reason to do you any favors, right? And not only that, but they would see you as, maybe they would say, oh, well, you are a guy who's already has so many favors done by this system, which is structurally racist. Not only are we not going to help you out, but you know, maybe it just balances out that if you're not helped out, so or something. But this in some ironic way, the fact that you can't, is basically this creates this sense that in the free, liberal, individualistic society, you have to you have to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. You can't rely on anybody else for anything. And the fact that you're basically left in this very atomized position creates this Jungian anadiodromia, where the highly individualistic liberal society creates a breeding grounds for fascism, because people are unable to do this, basically, that they feel they need to be part of some sort of group. And this is kind of like I would argue that the Mussolini corporate fascism is another expression of this, because it's like, instead of Mussolini, was interesting because he was less about racism, but more about the business, because people need some sort of security and belonging, and that by joining a corporation, not only do you get your paycheck, which gives you security, but then you have social belonging of belonging to that corporate life, you know, and that's your corporate office family life. And then when you're in there, you're under constant scrutiny of, like, you have to dress a certain way, and you have to show up on time, and you have to, everything has to be efficient, the trains have to run on time, and you have to contribute your, you know, all this kind of stuff. This is basically, even if our liberal society is an attempt to take this corporate culture, which is highly individualistic, and progressively move that away from its inherently fascistic tendencies towards something which is like basically has been turned into a politics of accessibility, of how to make the strength and power that comes from corporate life accessible to the most people, so that there's minimum barriers to that kind of lifestyle. But then there's a risk where then that kind of corporate egalitarian liberal, like the solution to the atomization of individualism is to join the corporate conglomerate, basically, right? And that this is basically the problem about this. For example, there's a whole other issue. There's a whole other idea that I had for this video that I haven't gone into, but it's like, by doing, like, you know, like, how are you branding yourself? What's your corporate branding? You could take the fascism out of this and just talk about it as a cutting edge corporate branding strategy, right? Have you guys ever thought that, like, there's something kind of like the way Adidas have those stripes on the shoulders, that there's something sort of like subtly militaristic about, like, it's almost like you're wearing a little military uniform or something. Sports logos kind of remind me of this. Like, there's everybody is wearing the same thing, and it's like your choice as a consumer. You have a choice of brands to buy, but then when you go out and everybody's just wearing the exact same brand, and it's like as if everybody's wearing a uniform, and you're like, oh, okay, wait a minute, I thought we were all individuals, but no, apparently we all have to have the same lifestyle, wear the same clothes, go to the same gym, cheer for the same sports teams, blah blah blah. Or the difference is that, what, you know, you get to choose for this team to root for, I get to choose for that team to root for, but it's you know, they're just, you could trade players back and forth. It doesn't matter, right? But there's still, there's a kind of underlying fascism in the whole, like micro-fascism in the whole game, right? Maybe I'm just rambling about this. There's some underlying issue about, like, what team are you on? What's your branding? And this is one of the things that I have to admit, was that I was tempted. I still actually... there's this thing about Hellenistic astrology. I'm tempted to brand myself as a Hellenistic astrologer, but if I was really going to do this and be serious about it, I would just take the outer planets out, take out Pluto, take out Neptune, take out Uranus, and just do. But like, if you did that, we would miss this really interesting, Pluto sextile Neptune, Neptune sextile Uranus with a trine and everything. It's like there's some interesting outer planet stuff going on, so I just want to include them, right? So, but that would be, technically, I'm not really on brand for being a Hellenistic astrologer by including the outer planets. But there's a popular style of astrology that is, I studied with Adam Ellenboss, and I learned from Chris Brennan's Hellenistic astrology textbook that this, if I was to choose my brand of astrology, I basically go with these guys. This is the kind of astrology that I like to do. I like to use whole sign houses, if you haven't noticed, right? Then there's all these kinds of decisions about this where there's certain other kind of things where there could be conflicts, rifts between one brand and another. And like, one of the things about this is that there are also archetypal astrologers. And one of the kind of issues about this is that I was kind of debating whether or not to take some more classes or courses with astrology with the archetypal guys. But there's something about the branding of archetypal astrology that it's just, I'm not going to get into the details now, but it's just not how I'd want to brand myself. And as an astrologer, I wouldn't want to be like, I'm on the archetypal astrologer team, right? But there's this kind of like, I've talked online with this guy, Ren Butler, who is also a local Canadian guy, and I was almost thinking about doing like one of his like in-person things, but like then COVID happened, and there's this kind of thing about like the pressure to like join the corporate team, and it's like, I don't know if is it authentic though? Do you really, it's like being in a job interview. Do you really believe in the ideals of our corporate brand and our mission statement, what it stands for? That's kind of what it feels like to me, right? And there's this sort of like with Pluto square Mercury, there's like a certain kind of like fake it until you make it quality, or a certain kind of subtlety where you might want to be manipulative, right? For the sake of your own power and your own Machiavellian ladder climbing, you may exaggerate how much you believe in a certain brand or style or something. But to be honest, I'm not going to get into it here. I have certain grades where I wouldn't, to be authentic and true to my vision of astrology, I wouldn't want to brand myself as one of these archetypal astrologer guys. It's just not my preferred style. The main thing though that I was thinking about is that what if, evolutionary astrology, basically. What I find interesting is that the previous definition of fascism, if fascism is all about superhumans and subhumans, and there's this funny thing about evolutionary astrology, because like there's this evolutionary progressive mentality, is there something fascistic about it, right? Or the problem is basically, I don't want to just tar and feather I'm getting myself into trouble now. The problem is that it's not just them, it's the human potential movement. There's this whole, like Elon and stuff. There's this whole idea of people who wanted to like develop, the human extrasensory abilities, ESP, or different exploring visionary states with psychedelics, ayahuasca fascism. This is, if like psychedelics are like, then there's the normal state of being a human, but if we take all these drugs, we're going to enhance ourselves and become superhumans. Does this by default make you into a fascist, right? Or then if you are then a burnout who goes back to live with your family, then rather than participating as a fair egalitarian member of a liberal social democracy, is it like, okay, my own self-criticism? I'm not in a position to criticize anybody because I burnt out from partying too hard, and now I'm coasting on my laurels by inheriting the vast wealth of my privileged family. I'm kind of being sarcastic here because I don't stand to inherit a massive fortune. It's pretty modest. But there is, I'm privileged enough to be able to collect Eurorack modules and to have some. I'm in a better financial. This is the thing. I'm sort of the petite bourgeois, right? What can I say? I have a small amount of privilege, and just enough to feel vaguely guilty, and that I have to constantly, and like as a white liberal, I have to basically constantly apologize for for any position that I have of advantage in over anybody else, and always be ready to sacrifice it and give it up, right? And basically submit to so that somebody else can take the to take the spotlight. I can take the back seat and let the everybody else succeed, basically, right? This is basically my attempt at doing a self-criticism rather than act like I am trying to, make, threatening political claims at other people, right? But I'm also taking full advantage of the fact that I do live in a free liberal democracy that gives me the freedom of speech to totally express these ideas as much as I see fit, basically, right? There is this kind of underlying issue, though, about evolutionary astrology, and are some souls more highly evolved than others, and that are the souls which are not highly evolved some kind of subhuman, parasite that needs to be purged, right? And are the hippies basically just fascists by default, right? For that reason. And this is basically me. I don't know. I was doing some tarot cards, and this, maybe counterintuitively, this seemed like a good direction to take this video. I have a certain. I'm not. This is the point. I don't want to. We all saw what happened with the house division wars, Placidus versus Whole Sign. I'm just look. I'm not gonna beat around the bush and just pretend that I'm more neutral on things than not. I'm not. I prefer using whole sign houses, and I'm not sure if I would join sides with the evolutionary astrologers or the archetypal astrologers, but there's some sort of, like, with Pluto and Aquarius, basically, to me, it feels like a kind of a corporate pressure to join up with the corporation and adopt the common practice, so that you feel like you have the comfort of being part of something that, other than just having a familial advantage, that I come from this sort of the prestige of coming from this bloodline or this sort of lineage or something like this, right? There's some kind of this is the kind of thing that they often talk about, transformation or evolution with Pluto. This is what I'm trying to get at, is there something about the Pluto archetype which is inherently fascistic, because it's like, in order to progress as a society, to be really liberal and to be really progressive would mean basically to abolish the family, because the family is basically where you get stuff without having to work for it. It's like you just inherit. This is the whole point, though, is we shouldn't be targeting the average family that's just trying to live a good life, or trying to do their best just to live comfortably. Instead, I think the answer is to look at the things, like, from a position of Canadian politics, that we still make our laws, we still establish rule of law under the rule of the crown, basically, right? there's even something that happened recently where there's a woman calling herself the Queen of Canada who is going to be like the sovereign citizen who didn't. We have a certain. That would be a perfect example of this Mercury Pluto dynamic, where there's a certain kind of legal issue about whether or not we respect the British monarchy, and to what weight does that still carry? And what if there's different kinds of things going on, because historical progressive evolution could be like evolving away from the old monarchy system towards a liberal democracy. And the fact that we're having such problems in the United States with that just goes to show that we're still working out the bugs, basically, right? We still need to do patch updates, security updates to work on the software of Western democracy, because we haven't figured it out yet. But there's some issue in that Canada never had a revolution. Britain never had a revolution. The power is still under the British Empire, basically, right? And that we kind of sort of evolved away from that, but the underlying power structure is still there. And to the point where the British monarchy still controls massive amounts of land that they don't have to pay tax. The basic thing is that, I can do all the liberal apologizing that I want, but when I get my nepotism wealth transfer, it's going to be they're going to get taxed the fuck out of it. And all in the name of a legal system upheld by kings and queens, right? And to do astrology, to practice astrology, is to signal to the monarchs that they no longer occupy this privileged status, that the common people now have access to the esoteric arts, that we no longer need to rely on these concentrated power structures. But the thing is that I think what happened in the 20th century is that the acceleration of technology and the progressive liberal agenda reached a point of its own anadiodromia, which is that if you reach an extreme, the more progressive and individualistic and diverse and blah 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 that you get as a society, then you go full circle, and then there's this thing where you're feeling so individualized that you feel this pressure to either join the angry mob, to join corporate culture, basically, right? This is basically, as a side note, this is kind of what Venus on the South Node has been feeling like to me. It's been very like to be like a corporate businesswoman who has to have like wearing the shoulder pads or something like that, and being very like everything has to be very tightly controlled, and to play the game, to get you the power that comes from being part of the corporate. And this is the whole thing you bring it back to the free speech and censorship thing. You got to understand the Jimmy Kimmel thing is that the whole late night talk show format is a kind of a relic of the olden days. They had talk shows ever since Jimmy Carson in like the 1950s, and it's like what people don't understand about this isn't just about Jimmy Kimmel, whether he's allowed to say things on TV or not. It's that the whole format of late night talk shows are on their way out, and then think about in the future, once all the boomers die out, do you think millennials are going to sit around and watch like Jimmy Fallon or something like that late night? Like, does anybody do this? There's a new this is the whole point, is that people are sitting. If you are a stockholder in capitalism, and you're looking at what's going to be a valuable investment, which it becomes more valuable over time, versus an investment that is just not going to do very well. It's not personal to Jimmy Kimmel or to Stephen Colbert or any of those guys. It's just the whole format of late night TV is like a relic. Even like Saturday Night Live is like a relic of the 1970s, right? It's like we have this whole. As a millennial, you had to grow up with this whole like being overshadowed by the boomer generation and all these references to these old cultural things that like there weren't in your time, but oh, it was so funny to watch like Monty Python on TV for the first time, or Saturday Night Live, or all this. It's like these are what they're going to do is they're going to basically sell off the rights to this so that you can get the SNL box set where you get like 5 decades of Saturday Night Live, yours, pledge now for 3 easy payments, blah, blah, and this is the best they're going to be able to make money off this shit. Nobody's going to want to like stay up all night watching Saturday Night Live reruns on cable TV. Like nobody there's also like late night TV shows. Nobody's going to go back and watch late night TV from 30 years ago, like Conan O'Brien from the 90s, unless you're going to watch like, we're going to watch one YouTube clip of some band play that was recorded or something, or like an interview clip or something like that, which is all, people are just putting those up for free. It's like a garbage investment, basically, right? And so there's this kind of the pressure of corporate conglomeration, which basically takes the old stuff, breaks it up, sells it off. All this stuff is happening, and that regardless of this, like it has more. I hate to side with the Republican MAGA people, but it probably has more to do with that than it has to do with the free speech thing. And the other thing that's odd about this is that, I'm sorry, but as a Canadian, it just goes to show the concentration of power in the American media world. And there's a lot of like podcasts and stuff like, I mean, I'm interested in politics, but I'm often just annoyed by how the like the feeling like it's an attempt, does feel like an attempt to manipulate the culture and make people feel like they're not allowed to just speak freely and say what they're going to say. But this is because why? Because if you had a talk show host, if you had your own talk show, then maybe it would get canceled or something, right? Or like if you had a sitcom on an American, or like this is the whole thing, is that anybody who's doing, or like the whole idea that if I'm trying to make content on YouTube, that what am I going to do? I'm like, people like my astrology so much that they're gonna give me a sitcom. I'm gonna be the next Seinfeld or something, and then once I do that, I'm gonna be dependent on the American media machine to be successful. And that is so like it's not. You know what I'm trying to say is that if you've got a bunch of rich people that have money and they're like, oh, if we like certain people, we will give them a bunch of money and pay them to give them a career, and that if you say what you want to say, and that the biggest risk is that a bunch of really rich businessmen aren't going to give you a whole bunch of money, that's not the same thing as being censored, right? If you have this huge empire of the media, and that you're like, oh, I have to conceive of a very narrow idea of what it is I'm going to say or what I'm not going to say, because this huge media, if I succeed, this huge media empire is gonna give me a career. What if that wasn't what your game plan was? What if that didn't even fucking matter? And what if it's like also like, why does it always just have to appeal to, like, if America is fucked, why should we be using that as the standard of what we should be appealing to? Why can't we have media companies that aren't, you know what I'm trying to say? It's like I think that there's any argument for anti-globalism is that we can have a diversity of perspectives, and if one country's media is totally fucked up, then we don't have, but there's also, it's also, have you tried watching the Chinese TV version of Three Body Problem and comparing that to the Netflix version? I don't know. Need I say more? This is kind of a long, rambly one. All right, stay safe from UFOs.